I had been a night nurse for some years. The ward I worked on was generally very quiet during the night, with only a few patients to attend to and most of them asleep at that time. So I was left with the routine tasks of monitoring vital signs, administering medications, and responding to the occasional call when there was an emergency. But for the most part, this shift was very quiet. My closest friend on the night shift was Laura, another nurse who had worked at this hospital almost as long as I had. Laura and I had developed a very close friendship, probably because we had so many things in common. We were about the same age, we were both from the same city, and we started working here at about the same time. Working with Laura was very comforting. We often shared stories and jokes during our breaks and always looked out for each other. But one night, during our last hours at the hospital, an event occurred that completely broke our usual routine and changed both of our lives forever. This had been a night like any other. The clock had just struck 2 a.m., and I was making my usual rounds, checking on my patients, and making sure everything was in order. Laura had been assigned to a different wing that night, but usually we always found time to meet and have a quick chat during our shifts, whether she was moving to my area or I was moving to hers. However, I hadn't seen my friend all night. At first, I wasn't too worried, because I thought she was probably just busy with her own rounds, maybe dealing with some difficult patient or had some emergency. It is possible for these kinds of unforeseen events to occur from time to time. Hours passed and my shift was coming to an end. I began to feel uneasy. I hadn't seen Laura since we arrived, and that was unusual. I had already sent her several text messages, but she hadn't even seen them. I asked another colleague I bumped into in the hallway, and she hadn't seen Laura either. I didn't know what she could have been doing all night that she hadn't communicated with me somehow, but something was definitely not right. I could feel inside me that little red light that goes on when things are not going right, even when you don't have any reliable proof or reason to believe it is so. For that reason, I decided to head to the wing where Laura was supposed to be working and took a look at the patients' rooms, hoping to see Laura attending someone at some point. But she was nowhere to be found. When I got to the nurse's station on her wing, I asked the staff on duty if they had seen her, and they all shook their heads, saying they hadn't seen her in quite a while either. However, the file showed that she had indeed clocked in for her shift that night. It was then when I started to feel really worried, and I started to look all over the hospital, checking every corridor, every area, and every place I could think of. I also asked all the nurses and doctors I met on the way if they had seen Laura, but no one had, and I could feel that something was really wrong, because if she had come to cover her shift, how come no one had seen her? It didn't make sense, and I didn't like this at all. Finally, and seeing that it was almost time to leave and there was no sign of Laura, I decided to check the security room. If anyone could find out where my friend had gone, it would be the security guards monitoring the hospital cameras. I knocked on the door of the room several times until it finally opened to reveal Luke, a guard I knew quite well, and with whom Laura and I used to share an occasional midnight coffee in the dining area. He was surprised to see me and stepped aside, allowing me to enter the room. Luke asked me in surprise about the reason for my visit, and I told him about Laura's absence, so he quickly led me to the area where the security cameras were being monitored. While looking at the monitors in front of him, Luke turned to the screens scanning the different corridors of the hospital, and after a few minutes, he stopped the video on a transmission showing one of the less used corridors. The timestamp indicated that it was around midnight, and there was Laura, walking down the corridor apparently accompanied by a patient, a man dressed in a hospital gown who was walking behind her, very close. Luke zoomed in on the man, trying to get a clearer view of him, but we couldn't see his face because of the camera angle. However, we did see Laura and the man disappear around a corner. Luke switched to the next camera in the sequence, but when the sign appeared, the hallway was empty. Laura and the man were gone. I asked Luke to rewind the footage, trying to keep my composure, as I was about to panic, And as the video played, we saw my friend and that guy walking down the hallway again. This time something caught my attention. The way this guy was moving, his steps were firm and sure, too much for a patient in the palliative care area, which was the area Laura had been assigned to. But hopefully that had been the only unusual thing with this man walking behind my friend, because there was something much more disturbing in the image, and that was that he had something in his hand. It was small and metallic. It looked like a scalpel. Upon noticing this, Luke immediately grabbed his radio and requested additional security to search the area immediately. I left the security room and headed straight for the corridor where the images were taken. When I got to the corridor, it was empty, just as it was in the images. Then I turned a corner and came across an old part of the hospital that wasn't used much anymore. And as I approached the end of the corridor, I noticed that one of the doors was slightly open, so I slowly walked in. This was a small storage room full of old medical equipment and supplies, which didn't even have a light. I started to move all the boxes and discarded devices out of my way, shining my phone's flashlight, when suddenly something caught my eye in a corner, and as I directed my moving light into that space, I saw with terror that it was Laura. My friend was there lying on the floor, unconscious and with her hands and feet tied with medical tape. I ran to her side to check her pulse. It was weak, but she was alive. I started shaking her to wake her up, and after a few moments her eyes opened. She seemed disoriented and frightened. I asked her about the man who had taken her, and she told me she did not know who he was, only that he had said he was a patient, and then threatened her with a scalpel and asking her where was the place where they stored the drugs. Fearing for her life, she pointed out which one it was, and then he brought her to this area, tied her up, gagged her, and left her there. I cut the adhesives that bound her. Once she was untied, I helped her with her feet. We got out of that place as fast as we could and made it to the main hallway, where we were met by Luke and 2 other security guards. Luke immediately called for backup, and within minutes more security arrived. "Did you see him?" he asked me urgently as his eyes scanned the entire hallway behind us. I replied no, and he told me he must have slipped out, but we had to find him before he hurt someone else. Laura was still very dazed, and they moved her to the emergency department where the doctors examined her and determined that she had received a severe blow to the head, and this was the main reason for her shock. But fortunately, she was almost certain to make a full recovery in the next few hours. In the meantime, I stayed with Luke to help locate the man who had taken her. Security guards and police officers searched every nook and cranny of every room looking for the man, starting with one of the pharmacy storerooms, the one Laura had pointed out to the guy before he tied her up and locked her in the storage room. But not only was the intruder not there, but not that he apparently could never gain access to that area because the security door still remained sealed. I joined the search along with other staff members, and as the hours passed, there was still no sign of the man. It was almost dawn when we finally found him. I had returned to the wing where Laura had been taken and retraced our steps when I noticed something strange. One of the doors to a supply closet was slightly open. The sound of a creak coming from inside made my heart pound hard in my chest as I moved closer, signaling a nearby guard to follow me. We moved silently, not wanting to alert whoever was inside. When we were close enough, I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. I pointed my flashlight inside, and there was the man who had taken Emma crouched in the corner, rummaging through a box of medical supplies. The scalpel gleamed in his hand. "Stay back," the guard shouted, drawing his gun and pointing it at him. But the man didn't listen. He lunged at us with the scalpel, and this forced the guard to react quickly, knocking the man to the ground before he could reach us. There was a struggle between them. The man flailed wildly, but the guard was stronger and snatched the scalpel from him and pinned him to the ground. I stood frozen as I watched everything until the man was finally handcuffed and taken away by the police, who had already arrived on the scene. The man did not say a word as they took him away. After they arrested the guy, the hospital slowly returned to normal. Laura took some time to recover, and when she returned, she was different, calmer, more serene. We talked about what happened a couple of times, but she never wanted to dwell on it. The police investigation revealed that the man was not a patient at all. He had somehow snuck into the hospital disguised in a gown and had been wandering the halls for hours before finding Laura. After this incident, the hospital increased security. But just the same, after that incident, Laura finally left the hospital unable to continue working the night shift. I missed her very much, but I understood her decision perfectly. All this had been very traumatic for her, and naturally I was afraid that something like that would happen again. I continued to work at the hospital and on the same shift. And fortunately, something like this never happened again. I was certainly afraid for a long time too, but the hospital, more than my workplace, was my home, and I wasn't going to let fear keep me away from what I loved to do most. But still, I will never forget that night. I own a cleaning company that specializes in the maintenance of office buildings for medium and large companies. Because of the type of work, we start our shifts at 6 p.m., Monday through Friday, because naturally, most offices did not want us inside during business hours while their employees were working, and in some cases, while there were clients on site. So that day, I arrived at the office building scheduled for 6:30 p.m. I entered the keypad access code and entered the keypad. I entered the keypad access code, brought up my equipment, and then locked the doors. The building was only 2 stories, so it was smaller than most, but both floors were very spacious and there was a slightly smaller basement level. I started on the 2nd floor and then worked my way down. That's how you get the job done when dealing with buildings. I started the cleanup chores regularly, picking up all the trash and removing anything from the floor that got in my way. Then I tied the bags and took them to the dumpsters that were near the parking lot at the back of the building. And while I was there dumping the trash, I noticed 2 cars parked in that spot, which I did not see in that place when I arrived. I was completely sure that neither of them were parked in that parking lot a couple of hours ago when I arrived. But the really weird thing is that there was not supposed to be anyone in the building at that hour, and there were no other buildings around. So the big question was, lighting up in my head was, who were they, and where were the drivers of those vehicles? I went back inside somewhat nervously and double-checked that all the doors were locked, then continued with my work, but occasionally checked the windows to see if there was any change with the cars, if they were gone or if there was anyone around, but it was the same. I finished with the top floor and went down to the 2nd floor doing the same process, but this time, when I went out to throw the garbage in the dumpster, I noticed that a light came on in one of the cars, but as soon as I got out, it went out. This made me quite uneasy, so I quickly threw everything away and went back into the building, trying to see if anyone was there, which made it that much stranger. I tried to work faster to finish the floor by 11 p.m., which was much faster than with the previous floor. Then it was just the small basement level and I was done. I moved everything down and got to work. This level was mostly full of boxes. It was more of a storage area than anything else, but while I was down there trying to speed up the work to leave as soon as possible, I heard a rumbling sound throughout the building. This was coming from one of the floors above me, so I couldn't quite decipher what the sound was from or which of the floors it was coming from. I put my things down and started to climb the stairs, but stopped halfway up when I heard voices coming from the upper hallway. 2 men talking a few feet away from where I was at a regular volume, as if they weren't even afraid to meet me being here. I started down the stairs and moved behind some of the boxes, then dialed 911, but before I had a chance to say anything, footsteps started coming all the way down to the basement. I only saw the shadow of one of the men on the wall before I hid completely behind the rack of boxes. I heard him walk a bit and then shout to the other man upstairs, "I don't see anyone, I think we're okay." He walked upstairs again, and I looked once more at the reflection of his shadow, but then realized he was holding something in his hand, and this was in the almost unmistakable shape of a gun, which scared me even more than I already was. I reconnected with 911 and whisperingly explained what was going on and where I was. Several minutes passed after that, and during this time I believe the men were mostly upstairs. But then they returned to the first floor and suddenly one of them yelled, "Hey, his truck is still here." At that moment, my heart skipped a beat, and my whole body tensed up. I was sure it was my car they were talking about, and now they knew I was in the building. Their footsteps started running down the halls, and I could hear them opening and closing doors. They were looking for me. It was hard to control myself and try to calm my breathing. I heard them running all over the building, knocking down doors and moving things right above me. But my moment of greatest terror was hearing their footsteps start down the basement stairs, and then I heard one of them start knocking over boxes and searching everywhere. At that moment, I crouched down behind the box I was in, trying to control my nerves and not make the slightest noise, but my heart was pounding so hard, I felt like they could hear it. The guy started to get dangerously close to where I was, and I almost fainted when I heard a box fall just a couple of meters from where I was hiding. "I'm dead," was all I thought at that moment. But immediately, a faint sound of sirens approaching caught my attention, and of course also the attention of the other man at the bottom of the stairs, who alerted the one who was in the basement throwing boxes just inches away from me, and who probably couldn't hear them for all the noise he was making. The man stopped dead in his tracks at his partner's warning voice, listened for a couple of seconds, and then they both fled the building. I, however, stayed hidden exactly where I was. I was so scared that I didn't dare leave the basement until an officer came looking for me. Fortunately, it only took 2 hours for the two suspects to be caught. They refused to say why they had broken into the building, but they didn't have to, because when they searched the vans that had arrived, they found a lot of stolen items. Safe to say they were not the smartest, as they seemed to simply guess if I had left rather than just start looking in my van to see if I was there. But either way, this was the scariest thing I have ever experienced. But fortunately, I didn't have to know what would have happened they would have found. Working in a burger joint was a pretty normal job for a guy like me. Often the nights were quiet, and only a handful of customers would come in for a quick dinner before closing, but that particular night was anything but normal. I was alone on the night shift as usual. At those hours, the flow of customers was so low that it didn't take more than a single person to cover the shift. The clock read 1 a.m. when the whole nightmare began. Tonight had been especially lonely, as it had been raining since early in the morning. The rain was pounding the windows of the restaurant hard, creating a somewhat gloomy atmosphere. By this time, I had finished clearing the tables and was about to close, when suddenly I saw a lone man standing outside in the pouring rain. The guy was wearing a black leather jacket and a hat that hid half of his face. He also had long curly hair, which came out in strands from the sides of the hat. He was quite tall, and the truth is that his appearance reminded me a lot of Slash, the legendary guitarist of the band Guns N' Roses. But there was something in his appearance and posture that made me shiver. Still, I couldn't refuse a customer entry to the store, so I opened the door anyway. The man walked in without saying a word. He was soaking wet, and just looking at him made me feel cold. But he didn't seem to mind the cold because he just walked up to the cashier and ordered a hamburger and a soda. He was considerably taller than me, so I had to raise my head to look him in the face as he placed the order, and when I did, I almost had a heart attack. The guy had all black sclerae while the irises were a water-clear gray color. My eyes opened wide in shock, because in addition to his gloomy appearance, this gave him an even creepier touch. He looked like some kind of very scary reptilian demon. However, once the impression passed, I tried to relax. After all, I knew that all that was not natural. Clearly, this was something cosmetic, so to speak, and it was not the first time I saw this kind of body modifications in someone. But it is not the same in the daytime with the sun shining and the tables full of people. Then, in the middle of the darkness of the night, all alone and with the sound of rain and lightning in the background, believe me, it is a good difference. I prepared his order, and when I returned from the kitchen, I noticed that the atmosphere in the restaurant was strange, as if silence and tension had taken over the place. As I delivered the food, I tried to engage him in a friendly conversation, but the man didn't respond. He just kept staring at me. Something in his gaze made me too uneasy, but I decided not to pay much attention to it. I only saw that the guy sat in a corner of the restaurant, alone and silent. I went on with my usual tasks, trying to take my attention away from my strange night client, but I couldn't help but feel watched, something that made me feel very uncomfortable. Minutes passed, and I decided to look back to his table. Then I noticed that the man hadn't touched his food. He just sat there, looking at me with those terrifying eyes. I felt like I was in a scene from a horror movie. I finally decided to approach him and ask him if everything was okay, so I walked over to his table and said, "Is everything okay, sir?" The man looked up, but instead of answering, he smiled in a very disturbing way, as this was a smile that did not reach his eyes. Then I saw that his teeth were also modified. These were pointed and sharp as knives. They looked like those of a shark. But beyond that, at that moment, I knew that something was not right. But I could not just leave it there. The man finally spoke, and his voice was low and creepy. "I like your restaurant. It's a good place to be alone." I didn't know what to reply, so I just nodded and walked away from his table. I walked back to the counter, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that washed over me from head to toe. The night was slowly progressing, and the man was still sitting in his corner, not touching his food. I decided to call the manager and tell him what was going on, but the call was mysteriously cut off before I could say a word. I felt like I was trapped in a silent nightmare, so I decided to take a break. I headed to the bathroom. I needed a moment to regain my composure, and while I was in there, I heard footsteps outside, and as I came out, I saw the man walking around the restaurant, looking at everything as if he was inspecting every nook and cranny. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't stay hidden in the bathroom forever, so I went back to the counter and did so. The man approached and finally broke his silence. "You have an interesting place here. I really like it." His words were unsettling, but not because of what he said, but rather how he said it, as his face seemed expressionless. His voice was low and gravelly, and his gaze kept drilling a hole in my face. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply said, "Thank you," trying to keep my composure. The clock struck 2 a.m. and the man still wouldn't touch his food, at which point I realized I couldn't let this continue. So I asked him if he needed anything else, and if he was satisfied with his dinner. Then the next thing he said left me speechless. "I need you to show me to the kitchen." My heart started pounding. I wasn't allowed to show customers the kitchen, and something about the way he was asking made me even more uneasy. I politely explained that I couldn't do that, because it was against restaurant policy. The man didn't flinch. He simply got up from his chair and started walking towards the kitchen. I reacted as fast as I could and started pressing the panic button behind the counter, but I don't know if the button was working, as it didn't make a sound or anything, so who knows? Maybe it was broken, or maybe it never worked. Feeling terrified, I made a very bad decision. I ran after him, trying to stop him, and begged him not to come in, but he didn't listen to me. And when he got to the kitchen, he stopped and started looking around as if he was looking for something. In that instant, I felt caught between my duty to protect the restaurant and the fear that he was consuming me. Then the man walked over to one of the steak knives we had in the kitchen and picked it up. At that moment, I knew I had to do something, so I grabbed a frying pan and prepared to defend myself, although it was clear that I was at a disadvantage. Do you know what silence is? The silence of a child can be scary, right? The guy said to me as he advanced towards me with his sword straight and knife in hand. I prepared to defend myself as best I could with a frying pan, but it was no use. I was so terrified that I started throwing frying pans wildly, and as I did, he kept advancing towards me, now laughing at how pathetic I surely looked. The man snatched the frying pan out of my hand as if I were a child playing with something dangerous. Like a cornered animal, all I did was fall to the ground crying, accepting my fate, aware that I could do nothing to defend myself from this man. In retrospect, I know I could have tried to run. I could have thrown myself against him or whatever. Anything would have been better than just surrendering to my aggressor just like that. But you know, it really is impossible to act logically in a situation like that, when fear grips every fiber of your body, and all you can feel is desperation. The only thing I could think of was that a few hours before I was thinking only of the moment to go home, take a nice bath and lie comfortably in my bed to rest and watch my favorite series, while I prepare myself for another boring day of work. But suddenly it was all over. Now I was condemned to death by a man I didn't know, and for no reason. I was simply going to be the victim of a sick man who was going to kill me for fun. It was surreal. As if he knew what I was thinking, the man put the knife down on the table and began to run his hands across my neck, enjoying every second of the panic I felt and how helpless I was. At that moment, I realized something even more macabre, and that is, the knife was just to scare me more. But he never intended to use it. He just wanted to torture me to make my death last as long as possible. I could see in his face and in his sick and twisted eyes how he was going to enjoy what he was about to do to me. The guy slowly tightened his hands on my neck and slowly put more and more pressure. Slowly, I began to lose my breath. The force on his hands was getting more and more intense, so I didn't know if I would die first from suffocation or if my neck would break first. All I could think about was my family, my girlfriend, my pet, what each of them were doing now, having no idea that I was about to die. The pain in my neck was torturous and my vision was blurring. I was passing out. But suddenly, the sound of police sirens became audible outside the establishment. The man stopped and his smile was cut short. At that instant, he looked at me with a hateful face, but he let go of me and began to look around desperately, looking for a possible escape route. But there was none. I was trapped. As I lay on the floor coughing and trying to catch my breath, I heard the officers enter the restaurant. The officers approached the man, who was now desperately trying to get out through a small hatch at the top of a wall in the kitchen, but his large size made it impossible for him to get through, so they stopped him immediately without him being able to do anything about it. Apparently, the emergency button did work. This alerted my boss, who saw on the cameras everything that was going on, and immediately called the police. The man was arrested and taken out of the restaurant in handcuffs. He didn't say a word as he was taken away, but his horrified look and creepy smile were etched in my mind forever. After he was taken away, calm returned to the restaurant. My manager arrived almost instantly, looking very concerned and relieved at the same time after seeing that he was safe. I explained to him what had happened, and he thanked me for taking steps to protect the place. He assured me that the man would not cause trouble again, but I was no longer interested. I would never set foot in that restaurant again. Although the man was arrested, I never knew who he was or why he had come to the restaurant that night. The experience left me with a lingering sense of unease and fear. The silence and the look of that psychopath remained with me long after he was arrested. That night of terror at the hamburger restaurant was an experience I will never forget. I learned that sometimes evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, and that silence can be more terrifying than any scream. Since then, I have never worked the night shift again, and I always made sure that the doors to my house were locked, because I couldn't help but feel that sooner or later that man would come back to my house to finish what he started. I've been a police officer in my county for almost a decade. I've seen some crazy and disturbing things that sometimes make me wonder why I chose this career, but what happened that night stuck with me forever. It was nearing the end of winter, but where I am it's cold until mid-spring. Tonight I was scheduled to patrol the main road in my town. For most of my shift on a typical night, I would probably stop 2 or 3 cars for speeding and otherwise not do much else. Sometimes a call for backup would come in, but usually the patrol shifts were the most boring and uneventful. That night I was driving down the highway doing my usual route until about 2 a.m. That's when I passed a car parked on the side of the road that wasn't there before. The car was very much on the shoulder of the road and had its lights off and the driver's door open, so I didn't see it until I was already passing it. I turned at the next exit and made a complete circle, which took me 15 minutes before I got back to where I had seen it. I figured it was just an abandoned, broken-down vehicle that I may not have noticed before for whatever reason, so I was in no hurry. I parked behind it, about 15 feet away, and left the headlights on. I looked toward the vehicle and radioed in that I was investigating a presumably empty car on the southbound freeway, then got out with my flashlight and walked toward the car. The first thing that caught my attention was how old it was. It looked like something from the 15th century and was rusted all over, as well as being full of dents and scratches. I walked towards it, approached the driver's side window and held my flashlight. There was no one inside, but as I checked, I noticed some really disturbing signs. The first one there were women's clothes on the back seat. There was a jacket, jeans, a blouse, and underwear. All the clothes were folded and placed one on top of the other carefully. This caught my attention powerfully, because it was a complete attire of a woman, as if it was arranged there for a woman to wear them, or as if a woman had taken those clothes off there. I moved to the other side of the vehicle, but a faint sound behind me caught my attention. I quickly turned and pointed my flashlight towards the woods surrounding the road, and immediately the sound stopped. But I had heard it enough to know it was footsteps. Someone was walking around, maybe even looking at me. I ducked behind the car and shouted, signaling them to move toward the light with my hands raised. A moment passed, and then I shouted again, but all was silent. I felt my heart pounding in my chest as I called to update the department on the situation. I stood there looking out into the woods for a few moments and honestly fearing for my life. If something had happened here, there would be reason for whoever was there in the woods to try to stop me from finding evidence of a crime or any wrongdoing. As I got out, I raised my firearm and moved closer behind the car, keeping an eye on the tree line but not exposing my entire body. The next 5 minutes were brutally stressful, but finally another officer arrived on scene, and I immediately heard running footsteps further into the woods. We immediately set about searching the vehicle, and it was clear that something was going on. But searching the woods in the middle of the night while someone probably dangerous was outside was not a safe option. Instead, we set about thoroughly searching the vehicle. My instinct told me that we would find something important. Inside the car, we found indicators of violence. We found an empty ammunition package, a knife, a rope, duct tape, and a pipe, and what appeared to be a cocktail of different types of prohibited substances. But in addition, under the passenger seat, we found a woman's tendril and a box of condoms that appeared to have been chewed open. These findings were no less than alarming, and just as I feared when I heard the footsteps in the woods, the subject was most likely armed, but without a doubt, The most worrisome thing is that all these elements, together with the women's clothing that was in the back seat, were important indicators of a possible crime of a sexual nature. Fearing the worst, my partner and I proceeded to open the trunk of the vehicle, and what we found there is something that will remain in my memory forever. Upon opening the trunk, unfortunately, our suspicions were confirmed. In the dirty drawer there was the body of a young woman, gagged and bound hand and foot with the same type of rope that we found inside the vehicle. But the most shocking thing was the state in which the unfortunate victim was found. She had her body and face full of bruises and what appeared to be bite marks. She also had several broken fingernails, a sign that she had defended herself. But the most striking and later confirmed cause of death was a horrible dark mark on her neck, a sign that she had been strangled. We immediately called the forensic unit to remove the young woman's body. The next day we were able to do a more thorough investigation, but the car proved to be untraceable. However, thanks to the tissues found under the victim's fingernails, we were able to do DNA analysis, by means of which we were able to identify the assailant. It was a 42-year-old man who already had a previous arrest record for sexual abuse and illegal possession of weapons. It took us only 3 days to find him. He was arrested while trying to cross into another state in a stolen car. The victim was identified, but I will reserve her name out of respect. But she was a 21-year-old nursing student whom this psychopath had kidnapped when she was leaving a shopping mall that same night. This case really broke my heart and to this day remains one of the most shocking and unfortunate things I have had to see in my entire career. To be able to catch this sick man and put him behind bars reminded me why I chose this career. And it is precisely my desire to get these types of pests that seem to have come into this world for the sole purpose of causing pain and suffering to people off the streets. This girl was a studious, hard-working young woman with dreams to fulfill and with a family that loved her. But sadly, she had to leave this world before her time, and in a dreadful way, thanks to the wickedness of a despicable human being. This case marked me deeply, but although there was nothing I could do to give this girl back the life that this degenerate took from her, at least I have the consolation of having contributed to justice. In 2018, I worked making deliveries for a pizza place near my school. I worked most days after school so I could afford to pay my car and rent. It wasn't a great job by any stretch, but it was good enough to get me through college without being completely broke. That night was no different than most at first. I checked in at 6 p.m. as usual and delivered pizzas for 3 hours straight, then took a lunch break and started again at 9:30. I picked up the next order and started heading up to the place. The address didn't look like a house, but the route it took me to get there wasn't what I expected. It took me further out of town, far removed from most of the usual houses and stores. This was more like in a small business center, an area full of small office buildings and nothing else. I drove down the road and really couldn't decipher what the exact address was, so I just followed the directions on the GPS and hoped it would take me to the right parking lot. In this way, I drove through a rather long parking area until I got to the front of a building and could read that the address matched the one on the order, but something was wrong. The parking lot was completely empty. Even the street lights were not on, and the office building had no signs of anyone being inside. I double-checked the address thinking there must be a mistake, but everything was fine. I even tried Googling it to see if I could find anyone at a nearby location with the same address. But no, this was it. I parked my car and got out looking around before walking to the glass door of the building. I knocked on the door, then stepped back and waited. It only took a moment before the door opened. I was greeted by a middle-aged man who was wearing very casual clothes and had a small smile on his face. He suddenly became overly excited and said he was happy that the food had finally arrived because everyone was hungry. I looked behind him without seeing anyone else. Only a light on in the middle of the aisle was visible, but I ignored him and just told him his bill. He must have noticed my curious look behind him, because he immediately began to quickly explain that everyone else was in the recreation room on the 3rd floor for a company party. I smiled to be polite, but the man was talking with overwhelming speed, so much so that I almost felt like I had to be faking it. The man pulled out his wallet and handed me the cash for the pizzas along with a $10 tip. But when I took the money, he asked me for a favor. He wanted me to help him carry the pizzas up to the 3rd floor. The guy had put me in a tricky position. I had already taken the generous tip, so I felt a bit of a commitment to help him, but then again, carrying a few pizzas isn't exactly a difficult task, and it didn't seem necessary for someone else to help him. This struck me as too strange, rather suspicious. This little debate lasted only a few seconds in my head, but finally I decided to help him. Yes, I know, a very stupid decision. The man handed me a couple of pizzas and started walking in front of me, urging me to follow him. That I did, but as he headed for a door leading to some stairs, I stayed behind, keeping my distance but following him to the stairwell. As I entered, I felt a blast of cold air and noticed that all the lights were off. Only the small hallway light illuminated the entrance to the stairs. Then the man started to climb, but stopped once he realized that I had stopped walking. At that point, he turned to me and made a joking comment about the lights. But to me, he made no thanks, and his smile quickly faded once he realized I was no longer going to follow him. It was then when I watched in horror as the guy's face contorted into a devilish gesture of absolute rage. He tossed the pizzas aside, pulled something out from behind his belt, and ran towards me. All this happened in a split second, and the man didn't hesitate for a single instant. I threw the pizzas on the floor, ran out the door as fast as I could and into the hallway, then ran towards the exit and even faster in the direction of my car. Fortunately, I'm a lean, athletic guy, and this was a rather stout man, so I got a good head start on the run. Once I got into the car, I started the engine quickly, and I could see the man partially get out the front doors before getting back in and slamming them shut. I immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, unfortunately, the man had already gotten the hell out of there, and since he'd paid in cash, there was no way of knowing who he really was. However, the office building was completely empty, and there was absolutely nothing on the 3rd floor. It was completely unoccupied, so it was clearly just a trap. What he had in store for me on the 3rd floor is something I will probably never know, and I hope no one has to know either. I used to work at a video store in Los Angeles in the 90s. We had quite a few famous clients there, even some porn stars as well. It was a somewhat crazy work environment that could seem quite unsafe at times, but that unpredictability was only half of its charm. I honestly loved the job, as well as the peculiar clients that came with it. I remember there was one porn star that came in frequently. I'll call her Alice so as not to reveal her identity, but she was quite well known in the adult film scene. She came to the store almost every day, but her visits were absolute dread because she only seemed to come when I was working alone, and she would always ask me the same question: "How many of my films did you sell today?" Now, she wasn't asking this in any irrational way. She was a little older, so she clearly had a whole career behind her. She looked and acted like she was crazy, but she was also obviously very high every time she came in. She usually came in with her mouth open, grinding her teeth, and her eyes bulged out of her head as if there was some special prosthetic effect on them. Alice was too thin from years of substance abuse and probably personal issues with weight and image. She also consumed too much alcohol and cigarettes, and most of the time she would come up to the counter and almost yell at me, "How many of my movies have you sold today?" She used to repeat this question over and over again with that wacky energy. I told Alice over and over again that our computer system would only search movies by title, not by actors or actresses, but this fact she never seemed to understand, and each time she would start yelling at me. Remember, this is 1995, so the computer I used to look things up and check rentals was a dinosaur, but it didn't really matter because she always did the same thing. Things with her were difficult and repetitive. In the end, I always ended up accompanying her to the adult section, and then she would look every moment looking for the covers of her movies. Sometimes she would hit on them. Sometimes she wouldn't, and when you didn't, she would be furious. But when she found one, she would start telling anecdotes to all the customers about that movie, the things she did with all the money she earned, how many superstars she was with, and things like that. The regular clients already knew her and didn't pay much attention to her. The problem was with the new clients, who ended up feeling terrified, so she always had to explain to them that she was completely harmless. I think Alice was even crazier than she seemed. This kind of scene played out at least a dozen times a month. She wasn't the worst client I had, but she became the one I feared the most. But then one week she didn't show up at the club. As the days went by and there was no sign of Alice, I was honestly relieved, or at least at first. But then I started to worry about her absence. I really came to think that something bad had happened to her. I hoped it hadn't, but the thought of it made me feel a little bad. However, a month later, when I had practically forgotten her, I got a big surprise when I saw her coming through the doors of the club, but not only because I saw her again after several weeks, but because she looked even worse than before. Alice looked like hell. First of all, she clearly hasn't showered for several weeks. Maybe since the last time I saw her, you could always tell when she was unbathed because her hair was getting more and more vertical. I don't know how else to explain it. It was like wires, due to the amount of grease and grime holding that overly dyed and unkempt hair. Her clothes are pretty much the same as always, sleepwear and half sportswear, but all this was nothing when I saw her face. She had a huge black eye, and her eyes themselves were completely wild, crazed. She had pupils like dinner plates, and the outer rim, instead of white, was tinged with an intense yellow. Is that I cannot even describe what her state was. I could not tell if she was sick or with more hangover than any human being I have ever seen in my life. She approached the counter as usual and started doing the same as always, asking me for her movies. And as always, I replied that I could not find them through the system, as it did not allow me to search for them by actresses or actors, but by title. Once again, I told her that to find her movies, she should go to the shelf and look for them herself. I could not do that for her. But that day her reaction was different. Instead of arguing with me before she started scanning the shelves herself, she gave me a look that I did not understand at the time, and that I will never forget. Then she nodded her head and left the store. At that moment, I thought she would do the same as last time, that she would leave and come back after a few weeks. I had heard of mentally ill people who were stuck in behavioral loops. Maybe visiting the video store constantly doing the same thing was part of their loop. But how wrong I was. The door opened about 30 seconds later and a big, tall guy dressed smartly walked in. I welcomed him but hesitated. This guy seemed to be very angry about something. He walked stomping up to the counter and I asked him if there was anything I could help him with. The guy put his hands on the counter and I saw that these were studded with shutters with all kinds of gold and silver-crusted diamonds between them. And then he started calmly explaining to me that I was the problem and that he was here as a solution. This made me nervous. My first thought was that he was coming to rob the store. So I explained that I'm just an employee, and if he wanted the cash from the register or the movies in the back, he could have them. The guy laughs at me, shakes his head, and then explains that he was just upset with me because I was bothering his friend, the one who was just here a moment ago. Hearing this really surprised me. I had no idea what kind of relationship there was between this guy and Alice. But I explained to him that I don't know her at all, that she's just a customer who comes in eventually and I try to help her as much as I can. But there's no easy way to find her movies, and once again I explained to this guy the same thing I did to Alice every time I came to ask about them. The guy interrupted me with a wave of his hand and started to say he had already heard every word. This guy had all the look of someone who was connected to the drug business and acted like he was Alice's handler, although diffidently she still had a career. She was so old there was no way he had her work the kind he did. At least not in the 90s. I mean, I guess there is a market for anything. But I had more of a vibe that he had a relationship with her. At that point I started debating whether or not to push the store's security button, since I wasn't even sure it worked. But this one was down at the other end of the counter, and if I moved, this guy was going to make me regret it. I had a feeling. At that point, the guy told me Alice's full name, and then her stage name. Then I realized that way I could locate her in the directory. Then he asked me what movies I had that she was in. Obviously, I didn't want the same excuses I had already given him before, so I logged into the computer next to me, opened the inventory list for the whole store, and started searching. In the end, I had to come up with a lot of ruses, and it took me almost an hour to find every single tape, but I found most of them manually, constantly checking the shelves for hidden copies. During this process, the guy was all the time following me around without saying a word, just watching me collect all the copies in a tub on the counter. He cracked his knuckles and circled his neck in intimidation. It was only after I started accumulating all the tapes that I realized how extensive Alice's career was. She was a mainstream actress for about 20 years from what I could tell, and had been produced by some of the biggest studios over the decades. It occurred to me that this burnout made sense, as did the guy behind me. I told the guy it would take me a minute and told him the price for all the movies. Then he asked me what I meant by that. I set a charge for the movies. I explained that I couldn't let 80 or 90 tapes disappear from our store. Then the guy picked up the B series of movies with one arm and slid a gun out of his waistband with the other. He looked me up and down and placed the barrel in front of my face and asked me if we were okay to like this. I sighed and replied, yes. What else could he say with a gun pointed in my face? The guy walked out of the store and I immediately called my boss and then the police. They both showed up 20 minutes later. The police took my statement and my boss filed the robbery report, then fired me on the spot. The truth is, the only thing that hurt me about him firing me is that it wasn't my fault in the first place, and secondly, I liked my job, but nothing else. I thought a lot about that guy. Who was he and why did they want those movies? That's something that to this day I don't have an answer for.